The Account Chamber of the Federal Council has launched an audit into the activities of the Central Bank of Russia. The goal is to assess the institution's monetary policy since the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine and to examine the impact of interest rates on inflation, spending and investment. A source familiar with the matter, speaking on condition of anonymity, told analysts and the Institute for the Study of War that this investigation is essentially an attack on the leadership of the central bank. The report also states that a group of lobbyists from major Russian businesses is pushing for a reduction in interest rates.
Unconfirmed reports suggest that there is tension between Russian Central Bank chairperson Elvira Nabiullina and the Kremlin over Russia's high interest rate and wartime monetary policies. Russian President Vladimir Putin has also attempted to shift blame for the rising inflation rate on the central bank, and on Nabiullina in particular. This was likely in an effort to draw the ire of the Russian business community away from the Kremlin and onto her. Although Nabiullina likely has not been able to exercise fully independent monetary policy, from a report by the Institute for the Study of War.
The Russia's State Duma public dissatisfaction with the central bank has also been expressed, as the planned inflation target of 4% has not been met despite a record-high key interest rate. In December 2024, annual inflation in Russia accelerated to 9%, and by February 2025 it had surpassed 10%. According to a survey conducted by the research group Russian Field in late January 2025, 40% of Russians believe that in 2024 the prices of essential food products increased by more than a third.
The Accounts Chamber's inspections never lead to anything, it's just a lightning rod, a formal bureaucratic exercise to bury issues that no one wants to solve. Besides, Kovalchuk admitted that the monetary policy situation is very complicated. Yes, of course, businesses are struggling, loans are expensive, and investment programs are being cut. But on the other hand, inflation is high, and something must be done.
Meanwhile, the central bank has stated that it will continue to monitor inflation trends and, if the situation worsens, is prepared to consider another rate hike.
They said the situation is highly uncertain and unstable, and if there's any hope for easing inflation and monetary policy, it's not until 2026. This so-called 4% inflation target just keeps getting postponed. I don't know, maybe our grandchildren will finally see it. And the headlines are all the same. Markets disappointed by the central bank's tough stance. Moscow exchange dropped on Friday, so they expected some relief or at least some comforting words.
Amid Western sanctions, massive war expenditures and an ineffective monetary policy, non-military industries in Russia are suffering. The growth rate of industrial production of the country slowed to just over 2% in January 2025. Furniture production dropped by 2.5%, while the textile industry declined by 3.5%. Steel production has also been declining for the past year. For Russian metallurgists, 2025 began with a sharp drop in exports. In the first 2 months, hot-rolled steel exports fell by 10% year-over-year.
The primary buyers of Russian steel over the past 2 months have been CIS countries and Turkey. Last year, Turkey imposed additional tariffs of 6 to 9% on Russian steel imports. Meanwhile, energy projects in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan are nearing completion, and local competition is increasing according to forecasts. Russian hot-rolled steel exports may decline by 10% in 2025, falling to 5.7 million tons. However, pipe exports are expected to remain at last year's level, ranging between 600,000 and 700,000 tons, writes the Moscow Times.
The key interest rate has remained at 21% in Russia since October last year. Analysts warn that there is still a high probability that the rate could be raised even further this spring. Reported by Katerina Bastun, Larisa Petruk, UATV News.
According to data from the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation, the federal budget deficit for the first 2 months of 2025 amounted to 2,007 billion rubles. This is despite the government's planning an annual deficit nearly half of that amount. The significant budget shortfall is explained by enormous expenditures. In January and February 2025, state treasury expenses reached 8 trillion rubles. A large portion of this money was spent by the Kremlin on continuing the war against Ukraine.
In the first 2 months alone, they spent half of the pre-war budget of the entire Russian Federation. The war requires a huge increase in spending, and you can see how strong this pressure is on them.
The National Wealth Fund, which the Kremlin created in 2008 to stabilize the economy during times of crisis, is also shrinking. Since the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, it has decreased their hold. Up to 6.5 trillion rubles was spent to patch up budget gaps and support state corporations amid escalating sanctions pressure.
By increasing military spending to its highest level since the Soviet era, Russian authorities have spent more than 20 trillion rubles over 3 years on weapons production and payments to contract soldiers recruited to the front lines. This has led to the creation of a money bubble, not seen in the country since the 2000s, followed by an inflation surge. In an attempt to curb this inflation, the central bank raised the key interest rate to a 22-year high of 21%. Meanwhile, budget reserves are nearing depletion. The accumulated budget deficit over 3 years has reached 10 trillion rubles, and the government has spent 2/3 of the National Wealth Fund's available resources to cover it. From the Moscow Times publication.
Another lifeline for the Kremlin, oil and gas revenues, started leaking after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The price of Russian oil fluctuates daily but is gradually approaching a critical point for the budget. Sanctions pressure from the US, EU and UK on Russia's so-called shadow fleet is also having an impact. Russia's largest operator, the company Sovcomflot, lost half of these profits in 2024 due to Western restrictions.
Oil and gas revenues in the Russian budget decreased by almost 4% in January-February compared to the previous year. Even though oil prices weren't very high last year, this had an impact. We saw that discounts on Russian oil were increasing, and the price of Urals oil was around $60 or lower. So, significant damage has been done to Russian oil and gas revenues in the first months of the year. The International Energy Agency reports that in February, oil and petroleum product export revenues fell by about $3 billion compared to the previous year, and that's noticeable.
In this context, even Putin has forced to publicly acknowledge the economic issues in Russia. He advised the government and the central bank to work delicately in order to avoid the collapse of the Russian economy.
Business is forced to tighten its belts due to the actions of the authorities. Starting this year, the profit tax has been increased from 20% to 25%. More than 10,000 enterprises surveyed by the central bank in January identified the increased influence of credit interest rates and economic uncertainty as factors limiting their investment activity. Minister of Finance Anton Siluanov called his responsible budget one of the measures currently being implemented by the central bank and the government to slightly cool the economy in order to reduce inflation, so that the key interest rate could be lowered. From the Moscow Times publication.
High interest rates are also detrimental to the Ministry of Finance, experts explain. The cost of subsidizing interest rates on concessional loans and servicing national debt rise proportionally as the interest rates increase. In 2025, the Russian government plans to spend over 3 trillion rubles on these expenses. In practice, this amount may grow as the central bank loses control over the economic situation in the country, reported by Alexandra Zaslavis, Larissa Patruk, UATV News.